Ethan Carter always said the best memories were made on the road with friends, and no one argued with him that March of 2007. College was supposed to be about finding yourself, and for them, it was also about getting out of the rain-soaked Oregon routine and chasing the adventure they believed they deserved. Ethan had the rugged confidence of someone who had spent weekends hiking, fishing, and convincing people he knew every back road in the Pacific Northwest. It was his idea to make the trip that spring break to Northern California's Redwood National Park far enough from Corvallis to feel like freedom, but close enough to get back for Monday classes. He pitched it like the answer to their stress, promising old-growth forests, campfires, and days away from textbooks and emails. He planned every mile of it on a paper map spread on the floor of his rental room while the others argued over snacks and who would get shotgun. Mason Lee was the least sure about the plan, but said yes anyway because that was the year he decided to stop overthinking everything. He was the kid who had grown up in rural Idaho, whose parents still sent letters instead of emails and thought of college as something rich folks did. He was the first in his family to make it out of a small-town mindset, even if he sometimes felt like an outsider among the others. He studied computer science and spent late nights coding until his fingers hurt. When Ethan insisted they would camp off-grid to save money, Mason suggested they stay at a state campsite with a ranger station, but Ethan laughed it off as too tame. Mason packed his new GPS device anyway, a fancy gift from his older sister who had hoped he might use it on less reckless trips. Andre Williams saw the whole thing as a rite of passage. He was a former high school basketball standout in Portland who had turned down community college ball to study psychology. He wanted to help kids from neighborhoods like his places where opportunity and trouble lived on the same block. He was charismatic in a quieter way than Ethan, good at diffusing tension when the group got rowdy. He liked the idea of a road trip because it reminded him of family vacations he had loved as a kid before things went bad at home. He brought a basketball in the trunk even though he knew there would be no courts under those towering trees. When he smiled, people felt like things would work out. He had that rare gift that made people want to follow him even when he was not leading. Caleb Peterson was the glue in ways none of them noticed until it was too late. He was calm, serious without being boring, the pre-med student from Montana who felt older than his 21 years, even if he looked like a blonde surfer kid. He was reliable enough to keep Ethan's wild plans from going off the rails, but mellow enough to laugh when they inevitably did. His parents had sent him to Oregon State for the science program, and had not been thrilled when he told them he was spending spring break on a camping trip with 3 guys they had never met. He packed his dad's old metal thermos, a first aid kit, and extra socks because he was the kind who thought of those things when others forgot. He called home the night before they left, promising to be careful and to check in. They left at dawn on March 19th in Ethan's rust-red Ford Explorer, that ancient SUV with one working speaker and enough duct tape on the back bumper to embarrass anyone else. Ethan insisted it had personality. Mason sat in the back with his laptop bag and the GPS clipped to his belt loop, refusing to admit he was nervous about the whole thing. Andre commandeered the playlist, blasting early 2000s hip-hop and classic rock in a truce that suited both their tastes. Caleb rode shotgun, holding the map pointing out gas stations and scenic routes Ethan promptly ignored. They stopped in Grants Pass for gas and bad coffee the first and last time anyone outside the group would see them together. A security camera showed them laughing, shoving each other playfully alive in that way college kids often are before the world decides otherwise. It seemed perfect then, something they would talk about years later when they had jobs and families and less time to be so free. They did not know about the red pickup that pulled out behind them when they left town, or the quiet warning from a park ranger they would brush off because they felt untouchable. They did not know their families would be left with voicemail recordings and old photos piecing together a timeline that never quite made sense. This was the last part of the story they would write themselves, the part before other people's memories and theories and reports took over. It was the part when they were still just 4 friends with a plan chasing the promise of a spring break that was supposed to bring them back home. They pulled away from the Grants Pass gas station with the sun peeking over the trees in thin golden bars that promised warmth later in the day. Ethan rolled the window down to let in the chilly air that woke them up better than coffee ever could. Caleb leaned over the map and traced their route with his finger, while Andre kept the music at a volume that buzzed the cracked speakers. Mason watched the world blur by and tried to quiet the worry that tugged at him every time the road narrowed into hairpin turns along the mountains. The SUV rattled over potholes as Ethan laughed at every warning Caleb offered. The day felt endless in the best way, with every mile carrying them farther from responsibilities and closer to something they thought would change them for the better. They stopped again just outside Crescent City at a small diner with peeling paint and a faded sign that claimed the best breakfast in California. They piled out, stiff and hungry, bringing the damp Oregon cold with them. The waitress was older, with tired eyes, but smiled when Ethan complimented the coffee. Andre teased Mason for ordering oatmeal, while he himself ordered a stack of pancakes as big as his head. Caleb used the payphone outside to call his mom because he promised to check in. He told her they were fine and would be in the park by noon. She reminded him to be careful like she always did, and he said he would. Ethan paid the bill in crumpled 20s and tossed a few extra bucks on the table because he said he respected a good hustle. They gassed up one last time at a station that looked older than all of them combined. The old man behind the counter asked where they were headed and shook his head slowly when Ethan explained they were going to an unpatrolled section of the park to camp for free. He told them he would not do it himself and suggested they find a designated site. Ethan thanked him, but ignored the advice the moment they stepped outside. Mason wanted to say something, but bit it back, telling himself Ethan had planned this and knew what he was doing. Andre joked that the old man just wanted to scare them off so they would stay at his brother's RV park. Caleb studied the map again but did not argue. They left the station with the tank full and the cooler rattling in the back full of sandwiches and drinks Ethan insisted would be enough. They passed the last cluster of houses and entered the forest where the road shrank and the shadows grew longer even in the middle of the day. The trees stood like giants on either side of the narrow dirt path, old and silent in their judgment. The GPS blinked in Mason's lap and lost its signal as they drove deeper, a fact he pointed out only once before Ethan told him to relax. Andre took photos with his old digital camera, saying he would send them to his grandma, who still thought California was all beaches and palm trees. Caleb marked the spot where they left the main road on the map, circling it in red ink with deliberate care. They reached the spot Ethan had picked after 2 more hours of crawling over rutted paths that threatened to swallow the SUV whole. It was a clearing with enough flat space for tents and a small circle of blackened stones left by past campers. Ethan parked with a grin that said he knew it was perfect. They tumbled out and stretched like cats waking up from a long nap, shaking off the long ride with whoops that startled the crows into flight. They set up the tents with practiced clumsiness, cursing at tangled ropes and misplaced stakes. Andre handled the firewood while Mason tried to find a signal for his GPS and failed. Caleb unpacked the first aid kit and extra blankets because he knew the nights would be cold no matter how warm the day felt. As evening fell, they gathered around the fire Ethan built with too much lighter fluid flames leaping dangerously high before settling. They talked about classes and plans for the summer and which professor was the biggest jerk. Mason finally relaxed enough to laugh at Ethan's terrible impressions. Andre told a story about the time he almost got suspended for fighting a bully who was picking on his friend. Caleb listened with his usual thoughtful nods, adding a memory about dissecting a frog in high school and passing out cold on the lab floor. They stayed up late, staring at the sky until the fire burned down to coals, Ethan insisting he could name all the constellations, while Mason corrected him half the time. Somewhere in the night they heard something in the woods that made them all sit up and listen with held breath. Ethan waved it off as raccoons looking for scraps, but Mason did not sleep well afterward. Caleb woke twice and checked the fire, making sure the embers stayed low and controlled. Andre snored through it all, oblivious in a way that made Mason envious. When dawn broke, they were stiff and tired, but ready to hike to a nearby waterfall Ethan claimed was only a mile away. They ate granola bars and packed their bags, leaving the site a messier version of how they found it. Caleb left a note in the car with the date and their planned route, because he believed in safety even when no one else did. They set off down a narrow trail that twisted through ferns taller than Mason and trees so wide they needed 2 people to hug them. The light filtered through in green shards that turned the world into something dreamlike. They joked less that morning, weighed down by poor sleep and the heavy silence of the forest. Mason fell behind, often checking the GPS that refused to work, feeling the pressure of wanting to turn back, but not wanting to be the one who ruined the trip. Andre walked with him for a while, telling him to relax, saying he would not let Ethan get them lost for good. Caleb led with the map in hand, even though Ethan insisted he did not need it. The last time anyone beyond their small group saw them was the diner in Crescent City, and the old man at the gas station who would later tell reporters he remembered the way they laughed like they had no idea anything bad could ever happen. He would say he wished he had tried harder to talk them out of it. The grainy security footage would play over and over on local news 4 young men full of life in that moment no one knew would be one of the last they had together. They walked into those trees thinking they were invincible, the kind of belief only people that young and that sure of themselves can carry without it weighing them down. Back in Corvallis, the Monday after spring break was supposed to end, the dorm halls buzzed with stories of cheap tequila and sunburns from the Oregon coast. Ethan's roommate waited for him with an annoyed expression because he had not returned the sleeping bag he borrowed. Mason's lab partner texted twice, asking if he planned to show up for their group project presentation. Andre's older brother went by his off-campus house to check in when he did not pick up his phone. Caleb's mother called his cell 3 times in an hour and left voicemails that grew progressively sharper and more worried. By nightfall, it was obvious none of them had returned. Their beds remained made from the morning they left their textbooks still stacked on desks, waiting for them to come back and curse midterms like everyone else. By Tuesday, their friends were talking in low, worried voices between classes. Ethan was not the type to miss a deadline without warning. Andre was always good about checking in with family, especially since his mom lived alone in Northeast Portland and expected updates when he traveled. Caleb was known for being responsible enough that people half joked he could be a camp counselor. Mason might have been a little quiet, but he was not flaky. The professors they shared noticed the empty seats and scribbled absent in their grade books. By Wednesday, the concern shifted from annoyance to real fear. Word spread in group chats that they might be missing, and the campus felt a little less safe for it. Andre's mom, Sharon, was the first to call the police in Portland. She told them her son was missing and had not been heard from in 4 days. She explained he had gone camping with 3 college friends and should have returned Monday. The officer on the line listened but told her gently that 4 college students going camping and not checking in immediately did not meet the threshold for a missing person investigation yet. He suggested they were probably late or had decided to extend their trip. Sharon argued until her voice cracked, but the answer did not change. She hung up and cried at the kitchen table, staring at the family photos on the fridge. Ethan's father, Brian, left work early to drive to Corvallis. He knocked on Ethan's rental house door and let himself in with the spare key he kept on his key ring. The living room smelled faintly of old pizza and wet socks. Ethan's room was exactly as he had left it, the sleeping bag missing, but his textbooks stacked by topic on his small desk. Brian found the envelope of cash Ethan planned to use for gas and supplies on the trip. Most of it was gone, but there were crumpled ones and a receipt for camping fuel stuffed inside. He sat on the edge of the unmade bed and held his head in his hands, imagining all the places his son could be that were better than the ones his mind insisted on conjuring. Caleb's mom, Margaret, drove to the local sheriff's office in person. She carried a printed photo of her son from his last birthday with frosting on his nose and a shy smile. She insisted he was missing because he was the kind of person who always kept his word. She told them he had promised to call when they reached the park and again when they returned. She showed the deputy the call log on her cell with unanswered calls and her increasingly panicked voicemails. The deputy took notes politely, but repeated the same policy about waiting 72 hours. Margaret left shaking with anger and fear so strong it left her hands numb on the steering wheel. Mason's sister Lauren lived in Boise, but spent hours on the phone calling his friends and their parents. She found out they had planned to camp somewhere remote and that Mason had brought a GPS device. She tried not to think about the device failing or being lost in a river or Mason realizing too late it had no signal in the dense woods. She emailed his professors to explain what had happened, and one of them replied with a short, clipped note offering sympathy and a promise to notify the university administration. She had stared at the message for a long time, trying to imagine the shape of her brother's absence in a world that had seemed so sure of itself the week before. By Thursday, the university police department received 4 separate missing person reports from family members. The dean of students held a meeting with the local sheriff and campus security. They agreed to make a formal statement asking anyone with knowledge of the students' last plans to come forward. Flyers went up around campus with their photos side by side. Ethan with his confident grin, Andre with the serious eyes that could turn bright when he laughed, Caleb with the neat hair and faint dimples Mason, with the guarded, half smile that made him look like he was thinking of something else. The words, "Missing please," call have seen printed in red at the bottom. Calls began to come in from students who had heard bits of the plan. One remembered Ethan talking about free camping in California to save money. Another remembered Mason arguing about safety and Ethan brushing him off. A classmate of Andre's said he had talked about the Redwoods, but did not know the exact spot. Someone else thought they had mentioned Crescent City, but was not sure. None of the tips had coordinates, or anything more than fuzzy memory. The search radius ballooned with each call, making the task of finding them even more daunting. Parents began to call each other voices, cracking as they traded what little they knew. Sharon found comfort in Margaret's calm practicality, even though both felt like they were screaming inside. Brian Carter called every ranger station in Northern California, leaving messages with volunteers who promised to keep an eye out. Lauren coordinated from Idaho with a notebook full of phone numbers and to-do lists she hated but needed. None of them had experience with this kind of terror. None of them knew how to organize a search from hundreds of miles away, but they tried because they could not imagine doing nothing. The authorities in Oregon finally relented by the weekend. The families had been too persistent and too visible for them to ignore. The sheriff's department called California law enforcement and briefed them on the situation. Rangers in the Redwoods were notified to look for signs of the group or their vehicle. Volunteers with the local search and rescue teams were told to be on alert for any out-of-place campsites or discarded gear. For the first time, there was a plan, even if it was only a list of places to check and names to watch for. Hope hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to go out at any second. The first real search started early on a gray Saturday morning with volunteers gathering in the parking lot of the sheriff's office. The families had driven through the night to be there, clutching coffee and paper cups that went cold before they could finish them. Sharon Williams stood beside her eldest son, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching the sheriff speak with the calm voice of someone used to explaining bad news carefully. Brian Carter held Ethan's baseball cap in one hand, twisting the brim over and over until the fabric gave beneath his fingers. Margaret Peterson wore a red scarf, despite the warm air, because she said Caleb could always spot her in a crowd when she wore it. Lauren Lee clutched her brother's photo in her pocket like a talisman, ready to show anyone who asked. Search and rescue teams were briefed on the limited information they had. They knew the boys had been headed to the Redwoods, that they had last been seen at a diner and gas station in Crescent City, and that they had mentioned a remote site Ethan had found on a map. The route they might have taken spread out in a spiderweb of forest roads and old logging tracks that could swallow a vehicle without leaving a trace. The lead deputy warned them it was rugged country, crisscrossed with old logging clearings and modern marijuana grow sites that did not always welcome visitors. He told them to be cautious but thorough, to check every turnoff and clearing no matter how unlikely it seemed. Volunteers divided into groups with maps marked in highlighter. They carried radios and whistles, wore bright orange vests, and left sign-in sheets at every trailhead they checked so no one else would vanish while looking for the boys. Sharon stayed at the command post, fielding phone calls and scanning the maps with the determined glare of a woman refusing to consider the worst. Brian joined a search party himself, stomping through ferns and fallen logs until his boots filled with mud. Margaret handed out water bottles and granola bars to the volunteers, thanking each person as if they had come to save her own child. Lauren sat in her car making calls to news outlets, demanding coverage, refusing to let the boys' faces disappear from memory before the search had even truly begun. The first day ended with nothing but mosquito bites and sore muscles. Searchers found old beer cans, fire pits, and discarded sleeping bags that belonged to other lost and forgotten campers, but no sign of the four friends. The SUV remained elusive, the missing piece of evidence everyone felt would be the key. By Sunday, local rangers joined in, driving miles of unpaved roads and checking trailheads for any sign of fresh tracks or abandoned campsites. Helicopters were brought in with spotters leaning out open doors, scanning for the faded red Explorer like a needle in a sea of green. They found cars with flat tires, campers who had simply moved on, and piles of brush that looked promising on camera, but revealed only earth and shadows when checked in person. At night, the families slept in cheap motels, or not at all, trading theories and fears in whispered conversations that always ended the same way. Sharon insisted Andre would not just walk away from responsibility. Brian said Ethan would have called if he could. Margaret repeated that Caleb had left a note in the car marking their trail, which meant he planned to return. Lauren scrolled through Mason's old emails for any hint of another plan he might have kept from them. They clung to the idea that the boys were out there waiting to be found, perhaps hurt, but alive, perhaps lost, but smart enough to stay together. They imagined campfires burning through cold nights and 4 silhouettes huddled around them, planning their way back home. By midweek, the weather turned against them. Rain came in hard, slanting sheets that turned logging roads into rivers of mud. Helicopters were grounded, and volunteers had to be called back when the creek crossings became too dangerous. Search dogs could not pick up a scent in the wash of wet earth and rotting leaves. The command post shrank back to the sheriff's office, where maps turned soggy and radios crackled with static. Frustration clawed at everyone involved. Deputies grew short-tempered, with families asking the same questions in different ways, hoping to get a better answer. Search leaders tried to reassure parents that breaks in the search were temporary, that bad weather would not end the mission, but the cold truth hung in the air like the rain itself. As the storm passed, crews returned to the forest with renewed urgency. They found evidence of other campers in the weeks prior, soggy cigarette packs, torn tarps, and cold fire pits, but nothing that could be tied to Ethan or Andre or Caleb or Mason. The closest thing to a lead was a set of tire tracks on a logging road that the sheriff believed might match the Explorer, but they were old, rain-washed, and led nowhere conclusive. Searchers argued over whether the boys might have tried to head south into even denser woods or turned back north towards the highway. The area was too big, too full of places to hide, whether by accident or by someone else's design. On Friday, an exhausted volunteer found a candy wrapper Mason had bought at the diner. It was half buried under wet needles, the print smeared from rain, but recognizable. The search coordinator bagged it carefully as evidence, even though it proved only that they had walked that way once. The families latched onto it as a sign the boys had been there, breathing, moving under those trees days before. It fueled another round of calls to news stations, another round of interviews where parents' voices broke, describing the sons they were trying so desperately to bring home. Photos of the 4 young men smiling in better days spread across local TV, printed in newspapers, pinned on bulletin boards and ranger stations. But leads remained scarce, and days kept passing. By the second weekend, the sheriff's office scaled back the search, officially citing a lack of resources and the near impossible task of canvassing thousands of acres with no clear direction. Volunteers still went out on their own family and friends, ignoring the warnings about dangerous terrain and illicit grow sites. Sharon called every ranger district south of the border with California, asking them to keep an eye out. Brian drove logging roads alone until night fell so black he had to pull over and sleep in the car. Margaret sent faxes of Caleb's photo to every park office she could find listed online. Lauren built a website with missing person flyers for each of them, linking every article she could find, updating it nightly with new pleas for information. The weeks turned to months, and the search that had begun with loud urgency dulled into a weary routine. Posters with the boys' faces faded in the rain on bulletin boards and bus stops. The families kept replacing them, stapling fresh copies wherever they could. Brian Carter kept driving south every weekend, tracing back roads with a flashlight and a notebook. Sharon Williams called every contact she had made in law enforcement until voicemails went unreturned. Margaret Peterson went on local radio programs describing Caleb's smile and his neat handwriting and the way he never forgot birthdays. Lauren Lee spent every evening sending emails to anyone who would listen, maintaining the website that was part shrine, part plea for help. Rumors spread like wildfire, each one offering hope before dying out just as quickly. A clerk in Eureka swore he had seen 4 college kids buying supplies, but it turned out to be a different group heading for the beach. A bartender in Crescent City called the sheriff to say he remembered them arguing about directions, but could not even describe what they wore. A hitchhiker told the police he had gotten a ride with 4 young men in an old SUV, but his description of them was so off, no one believed it. Still, the families chased every lead, driving hundreds of miles, asking questions in diners and gas stations until they were asked to leave. There was a day in July when a deputy called Sharon and told her a hiker had reported a campsite deep in the forest with 4 sleeping bags and a circle of stones for a fire pit. She drove overnight to be there for the search. They found the camp all right, but it was old and abandoned, littered with beer cans and food wrappers dating back years. The sleeping bags were torn and mildew-stained, left behind by another group who had their own reasons for disappearing into the trees. Sharon watched them bag the trash for evidence and turned away so no one would see her cry. Brian put a hand on her shoulder without saying anything. Andre's older brother, Marcus, joined the effort, then quitting his job for a month to help search. He organized groups of friends to comb the forest in a grid, even though the terrain refused to be tamed by their careful plans. They found odd things that kept them awake at night: bones that turned out to be animal remains, a charred patch of ground where someone had set a fire and left broken beer bottles, an old tarp nailed between trees like a shelter but with nothing inside. Every find brought the deputies back with measuring tapes and evidence bags. Every find ended with more questions and no answers. By August, the families were exhausted in body and spirit. Lauren stopped returning calls for a few days because she said she could not bear hearing herself make the same promises to strangers. Margaret took down the pictures of Caleb in the living room because she could not look at them without her heart breaking. Brian stopped shaving and his clothes grew looser on his frame as he forgot to eat. Sharon checked herself into a hospital for dehydration after refusing to rest or drink water during a particularly hot day in the woods. The searchers knew them all by name by then. They shook their heads sadly when they saw them coming, but did not tell them to stop. The sheriff's department called a meeting in late August to tell the families they were shifting the case from active search to ongoing investigation. They explained the difference with rehearsed empathy. It meant there would be fewer resources. It meant the maps would go back on shelves. It meant volunteers could no longer be officially coordinated under their supervision. It meant they would keep the case open, but there would be no more teams of orange-vested men with radios fanning out at dawn. The words landed like blows. Sharon walked out before the meeting was over. Brian stayed until the end but did not ask any questions. Margaret listened carefully and then thanked them because she did not know what else to say. Without official support, the searches became more desperate and less safe. Friends went out alone with nothing but bottles of water and printouts of maps. Strangers from online forums offered to help, but often just took photos of the site for their blogs. One volunteer got lost himself for 2 days before a rescue team found him shivering under a log. Rumors spread that the area was dangerous not just because of terrain, but because of the illegal grow sites that dotted the region. Some people whispered that the boys had stumbled on something they were not supposed to see. The families heard all of it and stored every theory away like poison in small bottles they could not throw out. The media attention faded as summer ended. Reporters stopped showing up at the trailheads and the phones rang less often. Ethan's friends held a small vigil on campus in September, where they lit candles and read poems they thought he would have liked. Andre's basketball teammates wore black armbands for the first game of the season. Caleb's professors asked for a moment of silence in class, their voices cracking with grief. Mason's lab partner finished their final project alone and submitted it with both their names on it because she said it felt right. Life moved on around the empty spaces the boys had left. The families refused to hold memorial services despite the whispers that it would give them closure. Sharon said she would not bury her son on speculation. Brian told people Ethan was just lost, and he would be damned if he gave up. Margaret prayed every night not for her son's soul, but for his safety wherever he was. Lauren left a porch light on in Boise because she wanted Mason to see it if he ever came home. They kept their phones charged at all times. They learned to sleep in short bursts so they would not miss calls. They memorized the sound of every car on their street, hoping one would stop outside and bring them the miracle they needed. By the time the first anniversary passed, the missing posters had curled at the edges, and the faces on them were ghostly under the plastic of store windows. The official search was gone, but the investigation had not closed. Detectives still fielded calls, though they returned fewer of them. The families gathered in a small church hall in Corvallis to light candles and hug each other in an unsteady line. They shared old stories in soft voices to remind themselves that their boys had once been just that. Brian told the room about Ethan's first fishing trip and how he screamed the first time a trout slipped through his hands. Sharon remembered Andre organizing the neighborhood kids into basketball teams so no one would get left out. Margaret held the microphone with shaking fingers and simply said Caleb was good before sitting down. Lauren could not bring herself to speak at all. In the months that followed, detectives began to refocus their work. With no new sightings, they turned to the background of the trip itself. They asked more questions about where the boys had been headed and who had known their plans. They interviewed classmates again, pressing for details that might have been forgotten. A friend remembered Mason worrying about signal loss in the woods, but had no idea where they planned to camp. Another recalled Ethan bragging about saving money by avoiding paid campsites. The detective scribbled notes on legal pads, filling pages with theories, but finding no evidence to anchor any of them. Attention turned to the SUV that had never been found. The Ford Explorer was old but distinctive, with a dented back door and a sticker for the university radio station on the bumper. Flyers went up in mechanic shops along the Oregon and California border. Police visited junkyards and scrap dealers with photos. Nothing came up. They contacted the DMV about any re-registrations under similar VIN numbers, but found nothing. It was as if the vehicle had been swallowed whole by the forest. Some whispered that it might have been torched and buried. Others insisted it had been driven out and repainted. The families refused to pick a theory because each one hurt in its own unique way. In the second year, the investigation turned to examining crime in the region. The area had a reputation for off-grid marijuana grows hidden in clearings under the redwood canopy. Some were small family operations, but others were controlled by men with guns who did not want visitors. Rangers told stories about finding traps on logging roads and warnings carved into tree trunks. A detective mentioned it once to Brian and watched him go pale at the thought. Sharon refused to consider it out loud but clipped every newspaper story about grow raids in Northern California. Margaret folded and unfolded a map until it tore along the creases. Lauren saved every article to the website and highlighted the mentions of violence in bold. Deputies who had searched in the first weeks were re-interviewed. One remembered fresh tire tracks on a spur road they never got to check because of rain. The report was buried under others, but now it stood out in red ink. A ranger had logged seeing an unfamiliar red pickup near the trailheads the same weekend the boys disappeared, but had dismissed it at the time because it was hunting season, and the area was full of trucks. When he was asked again years later, he said he remembered the driver glaring at him before pulling away. Nothing came of it, but it became one more piece of the puzzle no one could fit. Frustration infected every family meeting with investigators. Brian demanded they stop dancing around the drug theory and search grow sites directly. The sheriff reminded him they could not legally raid private land without evidence. Sharon asked if they had even considered talking to the cartels rumored to run the operations. The room went quiet at that word. Margaret asked about using helicopters again, only to be told the budget had been spent on active cases. Lauren quietly took notes as always, but this time her hand shook so badly the words ran off the page. They left the meeting with nothing new but the same dread sinking deeper in their chests. As the third year began, reporters stopped calling entirely. The website traffic slowed to a trickle except for the anniversaries when the local stations did quick segments that reused old footage of the parents at search sites. The families watched themselves on TV with dull eyes, recognizing the stiff set of their shoulders and the hollow sound of their voices. They learned not to expect the camera crews to stay long. The missing were not fresh news anymore. The world had moved on to other tragedies. But they could not. Brian still drove the old routes. Sharon still wrote letters to anyone in power who might care. Margaret still clipped articles. Lauren kept the site running. They all carried the weight. By the fourth year, the sheriff's office quietly reassigned the case to a cold case unit. The families received letters explaining the shift in careful language that tried not to sound like surrender. The new detective assigned to the file read every page of notes and listened to the recordings of interviews. He started making calls again, but most numbers had changed. People had moved away. Memories were fuzzier. He tried to keep the families informed, but each update was another way of saying they were no closer. He asked them to have hope, but stopped making promises. Sharon hung up on him once when he suggested they think about memorial services for closure. Brian refused to even pick up the phone for a month. The years stripped everything down to habit. Lauren paid the web hosting fee automatically every January. Margaret put a new candle in the window every March. Sharon stood at the edge of the woods every summer on the anniversary date and shouted her son's name until her throat hurt. Brian kept the Ford Explorer's photo in his wallet, the colors faded to almost nothing, still checking every similar SUV he saw on the road. They survived in the tight, uncomfortable space between hope and grief, refusing to let go of either. It was in the 5th year after the boys vanished that a retired park ranger named Walter Jenkins was cleaning out his old garage in Crescent City. He was planning to move to Arizona to be closer to his grandchildren and wanted to get rid of the piles of notebooks and old maps he had saved over decades of service. He flipped through pages yellowed with age pages filled with sketches of trails and notes about campers who needed rescue. Among those scribbles he found a log from March 2007 with an entry he had nearly forgotten. It described tire tracks on an unmarked spur road that he noted because they were unusually deep and looked fresh even though it had rained heavily that week. Walter stared at the words for a long time before closing the book with trembling hands. He knew he had passed on the note back then, but remembered how the search was chaotic and the weather had shut them down quickly. He had always felt guilty that he had not insisted they check that path. He sat at his kitchen table for hours debating what to do. The families had suffered so much, and the authorities had moved on to other cases. Finally, he called the sheriff's office and asked to speak with whoever was handling the cold case. When the detective answered, Walter explained everything slowly, feeling the weight of years in every sentence. The detective listened carefully and took notes. He pulled the old search files and found the brief mention of tire tracks buried under a stack of unconfirmed sightings. It had never been followed up because the roads were washed out at the time, and the team had moved on to easier access points. With renewed interest, he visited the area himself, though the trail had grown over with brambles and fallen trees. He took photos and measurements, but 5 years of rain and wind had wiped most traces away. Still, he marked it on his map and returned to the station to report the findings to his supervisor. Word spread quickly to the families. Margaret heard first when the detective called her at home. She listened in silence while he explained the new clue. When he finished, she asked if this meant her son might have been there. He admitted he did not know, but it was something to investigate. She called Sharon next, repeating the details in a flat voice as if reciting a grocery list. Sharon felt the old ache rise in her chest, the old hope and the old dread tangled together. She called Brian, who was at work, and left a voicemail he listened to in his truck before driving home without saying a word to anyone. Lauren heard last but reacted the fastest. She logged onto the website and updated the front page with the new information. She posted photos of the area and asked for volunteers with off-road vehicles who could help to check the spur road. Within days, she had coordinated a group of locals willing to cut through brush and survey the land. They organized like search parties had in the first weeks. Older volunteers showed up with machetes and chainsaws. Younger ones brought GPS devices and drones. For a moment, the hopelessness lifted as people found a way to help again. The search that followed was not official. The sheriff's department observed but could not sanction cutting trails on private timber land without permission. The volunteers did it anyway, insisting they were just clearing litter and brush. They found old beer cans and shotgun shells, but nothing definitively linked to the boys. Still, they mapped the spur road completely and made notes of every hollow, every bend, every abandoned structure within walking distance. They took hundreds of photos and marked possible areas for cadaver dogs to search. Margaret visited twice just to see the people working. She stood at the trailhead with her scarf wrapped tight and thanked every volunteer who passed by. That fall, a break came from an unexpected place. 2 hikers exploring the area found a weathered backpack tucked under the roots of a fallen tree. The zipper was broken, and animals had torn the outer pockets. Inside, they found a student ID for Caleb Peterson. The photo faded but legible. The sheriff's office took possession of it immediately. Forensics confirmed it was genuine. The families gathered at the station when the detective showed them the ID in an evidence bag. Margaret pressed her palm to the plastic and closed her eyes, whispering something no one could hear. The discovery electrified the case. Reporters returned to the story. News vans parked outside the sheriff's office for the first time in years. The families gave interviews they did not want to give, their voices shaking with the old mix of gratitude and agony. The sheriff's department organized another limited search, this time with cadaver dogs and professional trackers. They focused on the area near where the backpack was found. Drones flew overhead, capturing high-resolution images of the forest floor. Searchers crawled on hands and knees through blackberry thickets and fallen logs. But no human remains were found. The backpack raised more questions than it answered. Detectives could not determine how long it had been there. The weather had destroyed most traces of DNA. Caleb's mother asked if this meant he had died there, but the sheriff refused to say. He told them only that Caleb had carried it on the trip, and now it was there 5 miles from the closest logging road. The families debated endlessly what it meant. Brian insisted it was proof the boys had been in that part of the forest. Sharon worried it meant they had been chased. Margaret wondered if Caleb had been trying to mark a trail before something stopped him. Lauren listened to it all and kept taking notes for the website. The clue kept the investigation alive. Detectives reopened old interviews and tried to recontact anyone who had been in the area in 2007. Some phone numbers were disconnected. Some people had moved or died. Others simply did not remember details clearly anymore. A few mentioned hearing distant vehicles at odd hours back then, but no one saw the explorer. Law enforcement remained cautious in their statements, unwilling to promise results. But behind closed doors, they admitted it was the first solid link in years. The families clung to it fiercely, even if it was only a battered old bag left in the dirt like so much other trash in those woods. 14 years had passed since the four friends disappeared into those dark green corridors of the Northern California forests. Their families had adjusted to a new normal that felt anything but normal. Margaret kept Caleb's room exactly as it was, with his textbooks stacked on the desk and his old jacket hanging on the back of the chair. Brian moved Ethan's things into storage, but visited the unit monthly to make sure nothing went damp or moldy. Sharon kept Andre's basketball trophy polished on the mantel. Lauren maintained the website with steady attention, posting anniversary updates and any mention of the case in local news. Life went on, but nothing felt complete or finished. In October 2021, Lauren checked the site metrics late one night from her kitchen table. She was used to the slow trickle of visitors, the quiet sympathy of strangers who left messages of support. She almost missed the notification in her personal email. It was from Facebook alerting her that a new friend request had been received on her brother's old account, the one she had kept open all these years just in case. The sender was listed simply as Mason L. The profile had no friends, no photos, no history. Lauren felt her mouth go dry as she clicked it. She read the name over and over, unable to make sense of what she was seeing. She accepted the request with shaking hands. Moments later, a message appeared. It was short and strangely formal. It read, "I am alive. Ethan and Andre are dead. Caleb ran. Do not call the police." Lauren sat in silence, staring at the words, trying to decide if she was dreaming. She forced herself to type back, "Who are you? How do you know Mason?" The reply came minutes later. "I am Mason. I cannot explain now. Tell the families I am sorry. I need time." She read the exchange a dozen times, each reading leaving her with a new sense of dread. She called Margaret, first waking her. She could not keep her voice steady. Margaret tried to calm Lauren enough to get the details. She took notes on a pad with a shaking pen. She asked over and over if Lauren was sure. Sharon was next. She was silent for a long time after hearing the message read aloud. Then she began to cry in a hoarse voice that scared them both. Brian was last to hear. He did not believe it at first. He demanded Lauren forward the screenshots to him. He read them on his phone in his garage, surrounded by boxes labeled Ethan. He sat down on the concrete floor and read them again under the harsh bulb, feeling something cold settle in his chest. The next day, the families called the sheriff's office. The detective assigned to the cold case listened carefully, taking down every word. He said it could be a cruel prank. He said they had seen them before, people claiming to have answers they did not. But he also said it was worth pursuing. They submitted the screenshots to the cyber unit. Lauren gave them access to the Facebook account. Investigators began the slow process of tracing the IP address. Meanwhile, the families tried to contact the sender again. Lauren wrote long messages pleading for answers. Margaret sent short, desperate questions asking if Caleb was alive. No replies came for 3 days. On the 4th day, another message arrived. It read, "I cannot tell you everything. We were taken, forced to work. Ethan died 2008, Andre died 2010. Caleb ran. I do not know where. Please stop asking, I am sorry." The words felt cold and impersonal to the families. Sharon screamed when she heard the details about Andre. Brian threw his coffee mug at the garage wall and watched it shatter. Margaret went quiet and did not speak for hours. Lauren posted the new messages to the website and watched the visitor count explode. Reporters called within hours wanting statements. The families refused interviews. Police encouraged Lauren to keep messaging. They wanted more details. Lauren obeyed, typing slowly with tears falling on the keyboard. She asked for proof. She asked for details only Mason would know. The reply came with halting answers. Mason's favorite professor's name. The brand of hiking boots he wore. Caleb's middle name. It all matched. But other questions were answered wrong. Mason's nickname among his friends was listed wrong. He described Ethan's old car in a way that did not fit. Each message brought relief and then fresh doubt. The families argued among themselves about what it meant. Margaret wanted to believe. Brian said it was a lie. Sharon refused to say what she believed at all. The cyber unit traced the IP to a public library in Crescent City. Surveillance footage showed a man of indeterminate age using the computer. He wore a hood, kept his head down. Investigators circulated the grainy image but found no matches. They visited the library, but staff did not recognize the man. Police set up surveillance for a week, but he did not return. The messages stopped completely after that. The Facebook account was deleted. Lauren sat at her desk, staring at the blank screen where the chat used to be, feeling her chest ache. She printed every message and stored them in a folder labeled Mason in the bottom drawer of her desk. Reporters got wind of the messages and ran stories with blurred screenshots. Some called it a breakthrough. Others called it a cruel hoax. Online forums lit up with theories. Some claimed Mason was alive but hiding from cartels. Others insisted it was a scam for attention. A few trolls accused the families of faking the messages themselves. Sharon stopped reading the comments entirely. Margaret kept clipping the articles despite the pain they caused. Brian threatened to sue one paper for printing a photo of Ethan next to the words missing or murdered in big black letters. Lauren turned the website comments off completely for the first time. Detectives told the families they would continue the investigation. They admitted the messages were both promising and suspicious. They said they could not rule out the possibility Mason was alive. They also could not rule out someone impersonating him with cruel precision. The families asked if they would ever know for sure. The detectives did not answer. They changed the subject to evidence preservation and legal procedure. Margaret got up and left the meeting before it was over. Sharon stayed behind to beg one last time for help finding her boy. Brian sat in silence, staring at the wall. Lauren kept taking notes in her small black notebook, the same one she had used for years. Winter came early that year with cold rain that battered the sidewalks outside the sheriff's office. Inside, the family sat around the long table under a harsh fluorescent light, waiting for the detective to speak. He explained that while they had not found the sender, they had finished analyzing the message logs. The words were dissected like evidence at a crime scene. Experts noted patterns. They said the language was stilted and inconsistent, sometimes formal and other times too casual. The syntax suggested someone trying too hard to sound like Mason while getting basic things wrong. Yet, they also found details that matched things only Mason or the boys would know. It was an impossible contradiction that offered no peace. Margaret gripped the edge of the table and asked in a steady voice if they believed the messages were real. The detective paused before saying that they could not confirm either way. He acknowledged that some details could be guessed by someone who had researched the case, but others were deeply personal. Sharon demanded to know why someone would do this if it was fake. The detective spread his hands and said sometimes people just want to watch the world burn. Brian shook his head and stared at the tabletop. Lauren said nothing at all, but kept writing in her notebook, recording every word as she always did. The cyber unit had more to say. They traced the library computer's IP activity before and after the messages. It had accessed local news archives and missing person forums in the weeks leading up to the contact. Someone had been researching the case. The unit also found searches for local weather patterns from 2007 Redwood National Park maps and old Facebook pages for Ethan and Andre. Whoever it was had done their homework. The searches ended the day after the last message was sent. It was as if the person had vanished along with the Facebook account. The unit admitted they had no leads on who used the computer, and the library staff remembered nothing. Outside the meeting room, the families huddled together in the damp hallway. Sharon wept quietly against her son Marcus's shoulder. Margaret pressed her scarf to her face to hide her trembling. Brian stood with his back to them, breathing hard through his nose as if trying to hold something in. Lauren called a rideshare to get home, but waited with them until it arrived. They did not speak much on the ride. The driver kept glancing at them in the mirror but said nothing. When they reached Lauren's apartment, she waved them off with a tired hand, unable to find the words for good night. A week later, Lauren received another message on the website's contact form. It was anonymous, but described the boys' camping gear in detail and included references to the hiking route Ethan had planned. The writer claimed Mason had survived by agreeing to work for illegal growers in the area. It repeated the line about Ethan dying in 2008 and Andre in 2010, but added that Caleb had fled one night and no one knew if he made it out. Lauren forwarded it immediately to the detective who promised to check the IP. It traced back to a public Wi-Fi hotspot in Crescent City, but no surveillance footage remained. The families met again at the sheriff's office. This time, the mood was colder. Margaret asked if they were even trying. Sharon accused them of not caring because the boys were adults and not kids anymore. Brian did not speak at all, choosing instead to stare out the rain-smeared window. The detective told them he understood their anger, but reminded them they could not arrest an IP address. They needed a face, a name, something concrete. He suggested the messages might be someone who knew the area, maybe even someone who had crossed paths with the boys in 2007. Sharon whispered that she hoped whoever it was had nightmares every night for the rest of their life. That winter, volunteers organized another unofficial search after hearing about the new message. They chose a different section of forest near where Caleb's backpack was found. Old logging roads twisted into the hills like veins, some blocked by fallen trees, others wide enough for trucks. Searchers found the ruins of an old grow site with plastic irrigation lines and decaying fertilizer bags. They also found a rusting trailer half buried in blackberry vines, its windows smashed, and the door hanging open. Inside were moldy blankets, empty cans, and graffiti scrawled in black marker that read, "No cops, no snitches." There was no sign of the boys. Still, the volunteers documented everything and turned the photos over to the sheriff. The detective admitted it was the first real evidence of illicit activity close to the boys' last known route. He ordered another round of interviews with old contacts, including locals who had once worked the grows. Many had moved on. Some were in jail. A few refused to talk. One man agreed to speak on the record. He said he remembered rumors about outsiders getting grabbed by paranoid growers who thought they were snitches or rivals. He had no proof and could not name anyone specific. He claimed they would have been forced to work the fields and would not have been allowed to leave alive. It was a lead, but one too thin to chase in court. Margaret took to reading everything she could about Northern California's hidden cannabis industry. She learned about booby-trapped trails and workers held at gunpoint. She read survivor accounts of people beaten for trying to leave. She saved every article in a binder with Caleb's photo on the cover. Sharon joined an online support group for families of missing adults. She did not share much, at first preferring to read. When she did post, she typed slowly and carefully about Andre's laugh and how much she missed hearing it. Brian spent hours in his garage drinking coffee and reading old news clippings. He taped the last message from Mason to the wall even though he hated it. Lauren kept the website updated but closed the comments permanently. As the anniversary of the message approached, the families faced new requests from reporters who wanted updates. Some wanted to do true crime podcasts about the case. Others wanted video interviews for late-night specials. Sharon refused all of them. Brian told one producer to get off his property before he called the police. Margaret just said no and closed the door. Lauren sent polite but firm declines by email. They agreed they would not turn their boys into entertainment. Instead, they met quietly at the old church hall again. They sat in folding chairs under yellowed lights. They held hands. They lit candles. They spoke the boys' names one by one and promised not to stop looking. Spring returned to Oregon, with pale green shoots pushing through damp earth and cold rain dripping from the eaves of old houses. The families marked another year without answers by gathering quietly at the church hall, where they had lit candles so many times before. They sat in a small circle without much ceremony. Sharon clutched Andre's photo so tightly the edges bent and tore. Margaret wore Caleb's college hoodie, though it hung loose on her narrow shoulders. Brian set Ethan's battered baseball cap on the chair next to him as if saving a seat. Lauren held Mason's old keychain in her lap, twisting it slowly between her fingers as she listened to the silence that filled the room. The sheriff's office had agreed to meet them the next day. A new detective had been assigned after the previous one retired. He had reviewed the entire case file, including the messages that had shaken them all. He sat at the long table with his sleeves rolled up, a notepad open in front of him, a pencil tapping against the paper as he chose his words carefully. He told them they had finished their review of the most recent tips and the message logs. They had used every resource available. He explained there was no clear proof that Mason was alive. There was no way to verify the messages had come from him. He said they could not confirm the deaths of Ethan and Andre or the disappearance of Caleb beyond the fact that they had never come home. Sharon listened with wet eyes but did not cry out. Margaret nodded slowly, though her lips trembled. Brian stared down at the table where his hands rested, knuckles white from the force of his grip. Lauren wrote every word in her notebook, even though the letters blurred behind her tears. The detective went on explaining they would keep the case open, but it was now formally considered a long-term missing persons investigation. He said they would follow any new leads. He promised he would keep in touch. He said he was sorry in a voice that sounded practiced and tired. Afterwards, the family stood in the parking lot in a small huddle. The wind cut through their jackets and carried away the words they tried to share. Sharon pressed her forehead to Margaret's shoulder and let her tears soak the fabric. Brian wrapped one arm around both women and let himself sag with the weight he had carried for so many years. Lauren watched them for a long moment before stepping closer and putting her hand on Brian's arm. They held on to each other because there was nothing else to do. They could not bring the boys back. They could not force the world to give them answers. But they could refuse to let the memory of them slip away unnoticed. That evening, they returned to the church hall one more time. The pastor unlocked the door and turned on the lights but did not speak much. He knew their faces too well by now to offer empty reassurances. The family set up the folding chairs in a wide circle. Each of them brought something to place in the center. Sharon laid down Andre's basketball trophy, the gold figure catching the dull overhead light. Brian added Ethan's cap, worn nearly colorless from years of worry and grief. Margaret set Caleb's student ID next to his faded backpack that had been found under the roots of an old tree. Lauren placed Mason's keychain on top of a small stack of the missing person flyers she had printed every year without fail. They sat in silence for a long time before Margaret began to speak. She did not tell the story of the messages or the searches or the meetings with police. She spoke instead about Caleb's laughter when he was a boy and how he used to fall asleep on the couch with a book open on his chest. Sharon followed her voice low but steady as she described Andre's stubborn kindness and the way he would stay late at school to help younger kids with their homework. Brian cleared his throat twice before managing to say how Ethan had driven him crazy with wild plans and big dreams, but how proud he had been to call him son. Lauren closed her eyes and described Mason's quiet loyalty, the way he had been content to listen when everyone else fought to be heard. They shared these stories with each other like fragile treasures. They let the words fill the air that had so often been heavy with fear and accusation. They reminded themselves and each other that the boys were not just missing persons or case files or sad newspaper stories. They were real people who had loved and been loved. They had plans and flaws and bright moments that deserved remembering. Even if the world would not give them answers, they could refuse to let them be forgotten. When they finished talking, they blew out the candles one by one. Each little flame winked out, leaving the room in growing shadow. No one moved to turn on more light. They sat together in the dimness until the cold crept into their bones, and they had to leave. Sharon tucked Andre's trophy under her arm. Margaret carried the ID and backpack close to her chest. Brian stuffed Ethan's cap in his jacket pocket and held it like a secret. Lauren gathered the keychain and the flyers and promised herself she would update the website tomorrow. Outside, the air was sharp and clear. They stood together under the night sky looking at the same stars that the boys might have seen on that last trip so many years ago. No one spoke of giving up. No one said goodbye forever. They parted with tired hugs and promises to call soon. Each returned to homes that felt emptier than they wanted to admit, but they carried those small pieces of the boys with them, reminders of laughter and hope, and all the things they still loved even in their absence. In the weeks that followed, Sharon joined a support group in person for the first time and told them about Andre. Margaret started writing letters to Caleb in a journal she kept on her nightstand. Brian finally cleaned his garage, boxing up the clippings but keeping them labeled in case he ever needed them again. Lauren redesigned the website with brighter colors and easier navigation so people who found it would not just see grief but also the faces of 4 young men who deserved to be remembered. They all did these things not because it would bring the boys home, but because it was what they had left. None of them could explain why they kept hoping. They only knew that hope was the last thing the world could not take from them. In their quiet way, they vowed to keep it alive. They could not promise justice or closure. They could only promise to remember. And so they did. If you found this story meaningful and want to support more content like it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let us know in the comments what you think about the plot and where you are watching from. Your thoughts help us keep these stories alive and connect with viewers everywhere.